Hello and welcome back. After the huge success of the mini-series on Queen Mary I, I invited back Dr. Johanna Strong, and she has brought to us another great topic. I hope you enjoy.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's all totally free with no catch. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast mini-series on Queenship. I am your host, Dr. Johanna Strong, and in this series, we are traveling through time and around the world to learn more about global queenship. On the episode today, I am joined by Treesa Joseph, who's going to tell us all about the Begums of Bhopal and queenship in India. She's completed a PhD at the Institute of English at the University of Kerala, working on gender and sovereignty in colonial India. And she is a Charles Wallace Fellow. Her research works to retrieve and recover the history of women in power in colonial India, which makes her a perfect guest for our mini-series on global queenship. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strong, for inviting me over. Thank you.
My pleasure. So I guess let's dive right in. Can you tell us a little bit about you and what your PhD project is?
As you have already mentioned, I'm currently pursuing my PhD at Institute of English, University of Kerala in India. So my PhD project is an attempt to study Begums of Bhopal, a group of 4 queens who ruled a Muslim principality in colonial India for 4 consecutive terms, that is, a period spanning more than 100 years. I'm looking at the modalities of self-refashioning undertook by these queens to consolidate their position and power and their claim to the throne of the Bhopal as the reigning Begums of the Bhopal, that is, queens in their own right, not regents, not acting on anyone's behalf, but queens in their own right. And I'm more interested in the strategies and policies employed by this Begums of Bhopal to make this Begums of Bhopal happen and making Bhopal the Begums. We call them Bhopal's Begums Bhopal. It's not anyone else Bhopal, it's Begums Bhopal. And it is these aspects of how these women officiated their ability to rule is what makes my PhD project here.
I think it's always interesting. We were saying just before we hit record that it's wonderful to be putting kind of these royal women and these powerful women back in that context, that they don't just appear out of nowhere. And so that's, I think, a very exciting bit about your project is that context that's coming in. And so what got you interested in kind of this aspect of queenship and female power, and especially looking at the Begums and at Nawab Sikander Begum?
So when I started my research on the Begums, when I was doing my MPhil back in the 2018, my initial plan was not to look at, because I wasn't aware of the discipline of queenship, and I should concede here that my knowledge of queens in colonial India was limited to queens who asserted themselves in the form of military aggressions, like Rani Lakshmi Bai, Begum Hasrat Mahal of Awadh, who had been extensively studied both in scholarly discourses as well as they are extensively represented in popular visual mediums. There are multiple movies about them, multiple novels about them, but but then I wasn't aware of a different kind of queens who follow a different line of strategy to deal with the overarching presence of British in colonial India or their incursions into their sovereignty. No, like emphasizing the aspect of queenship or queens as a political category. I never thought that this emphasis or acknowledging that queens as a political category would usher in an altered reading of their lives. So my plan was to study not queenship per se, but how both colonial and nationalist discourses conceptualized and represented women who were assertive and reacted against colonial incursions into their sovereignty. That is when I happened to read books like Lives of Indian Princes, Barbara Ramazat's India's Native Princess, where I happened to read about this Begums of Bhopal, and I was like, who are they? And I was like, why didn't I know about them before? Why didn't I learn about them in my history classes? It was not just one Begum, it was 4 Begums in succession, rolling up Muslim principality for 100 years. And why were they erased out of the mainstream history? And that is when my fascination with this Begum started. It was just genuine bewilderment. What are they? Why are they erased? I realized that the strategies used by the Begum, that is to creatively employ the colonial discourses to their advantages, were unprecedented in Indian history. The fact that 4 female rulers ruled in succession dispels the stereotyped understanding of the queen's rule as unforeseen and a temporary arrangement. Still, they remained, in oblivion. What attracted me to the Begums of Bhopal was not only the fact that they ruled a Muslim principality for 100 years, but the fateful oblivion to which they are relegated now. I asked myself, why didn't I know about them before, over and over again? And it was this guilt, in fact, that I didn't know about this powerful women in Indian history before that actually led me to this research. Actually, it was like doing justice to my ignorance or the collective ignorance about them. And my research is an attempt to revive their legacy and bring their memory back to mainstream history. Besides why and how of Begum's 100-year rule amidst the benevolent sexism of the colonial apparatus and the native gender code of performances, it is a genuine bewilderment, as I put it before. And how could they consistently perform and exercise public and official power, not private and non-official power, to which queens are almost always, relegated or associated with. How could they do that was what attracted me to the Begums. And to talk about the discipline of queenship in general, what attracted me to queenship as a concept. Rani, according to Harleen Singh, who came up with a wonderful book on Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, I quote, is an elite colonial subject whose refusal to be restrained within the available paradigms of necessitates a larger multi-level project of representation, neither entirely victim nor agent. The Rani is objectified by colonial and nationalist discourses to perpetuate sexually, culturally, and politically viable modes of traditional femininity, unquote. So even as Rani was used in various discourses and mediums to perpetuate certain ideas about desired feminine virtues, the lived experience of Ranis in colonial India tell a different story of subversion and transgressions. In my opinion, queens in colonial India were the most unregulated group among the Britain's colonial subjects. Inaccessible for colonial gaze because of the Senana system they were in, because Senana system is the women's apartment, the harem to which they were constructed, and no male was allowed to go in. and it was guarded by eunuchs. And they also followed Parda system, which means they wore a veil all through their life, facilitating the fact that they can access the public. They have an access to the public, but there was no accessibility back, which was a very powerful equation, even though we call it a very, backward kind of a habit. It has its advantages too. Yeah. So along with this inaccessibility to them, there was also this facet of their intimate accessibility to their sovereign as mother, wife, and the doctor, which we can otherwise call as bedchamber politics. So these are all the factors that makes Ranis a very interesting and complex category in colonial India who have not been addressed as for their such, interesting intersectionary lives they lead. That is what makes Queenship very interesting for me. And colonial Indian setting adds very interesting features and facets and nuances and notions to Rani as a lived experience. In colonial India, there is no wonder that Ranis were considered an evil influence on the heir apparents. So British made it a point to separate the heir apparents, especially the male children, from the royal zenana as early as possible, because they thought that they are an evil influence. And when I was actually discussing this with one of my professors, she was suggesting that the kind they were called the senana, where the women's quarters were there. They were called places of conspiracies. And when I was talking to one of my professors, and she was telling me, this is not, you shouldn't call this conspiracies. It is insurgencies, Senana insurgencies against, the British discourse on demonizing them. It was interesting. And to talk about my interest about in Nawab Sikander Begum, it all started with an anecdote that is narrated in Shahryar Muhammad Khan's work, where he says that NSB as a teenager was a very formidable, spirited woman, and her mother was the first Begum of Bhopal, and Lancelot Wilkinson was the then political agent of Bhopal state. All princely state was assigned a political agent who will report affairs of the state to the central agencies. So Lancelot Wilkinson was the political agent, and he was kind of had a very strained relationship with the Begums, and he didn't quite follow the kind of spatial boundaries he should have. And in public one day, this political agent touched Sikander Begum's earrings. That means crossing the physical boundary in a way that is offending and insulting to the heir apparent of Bhopal. And what she did was she had administered a public slap to the British political agent. And this kind of narration, this event, anecdote, actually changed my perspective about Muslim women, or the discourses about Muslim women, that they're submissive, they're inaccessible, and they're unresponsive. And it is the ability of them, or the possibility that they are asserted themselves or reacted to their incursions into not only their sovereignty, but also their personal space, which had attracted me to Nawab Sikander Begum. However silly this may sound, this was what started beginning to. This was how Sikander Begum beginning to grow on me, and I was wondering, who was she? Oh my God, who was she? I should learn about her. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've brought up so many of the themes of queenship, and really these themes of empire as well, and there's these themes of power. We often have these Western European views on what makes a woman powerful, and there's often this perception that things like the harems and where women are separated, it's this trying to control them, when in fact, as you say, women hold the power in that situation. And how incredible. Just the imagery of the veil, that they can see everything, but no one can see them. That's just such a powerful image there of, the public doesn't have the power in that circumstance. It's the veiled woman. And I think that's one of the things that I absolutely love about history in general, is these moments, as you say, why are we not getting more of these figures? Why are these four incredible queens not something we're shouting about? And just the fact, I think most women listening can relate, that moment when someone just gets a little too close and you just want to go like, please back up. You are too close for comfort. And just like talk about an empowering moment. It's incredible. Like, that's one of my new favorite history moments.
No, right. I know, right. Yeah.
So good. And so it's amazing how kind of these one-off moments where we happen to read something or happen to hear something, and it puts us down this rabbit hole and this kind of different path than we thought we were going to take. But then it grows into this incredible field of research. And I'm sure, like me, many of our listeners will not have heard of the Begums before this, or may have heard of but don't know tons. And so can you give us kind of a brief history, now that we've kind of met them in their context? Who are the Begums, and kind of why are they important? And especially of Nawab Sikander. Who is she? What does she do?
So the Begums of Bhopal ruled from a period from 1890 to 1925, 100 years. And this period was of great significance to Indian history as well as colonial apparatus in India. So this Bhopal was not a very ancient kingdom or a state or something. It was a Mughal successor state. By which what it means is that it is a state that was formed at the event of the decline of Mughal power after the death of the great Mughal emperor Aurangzeb. So there was decentralization happening. There was no powerful Mughal ruler at the center. So all the Mughal governors and the mercenaries began to look for themselves a little fiefdom, which they could build into a state. And that's how Bhopal came into being in the first decades of the 18th century. So its founder, Dost Muhammad Khan, was a mercenary from Afghanistan. And when he started forming a state of his own, getting something from this state, getting something from the other state, he was carving a state of his own. He asked his kinsmen to come down to Bhopal, which was a very fertile area, which is Bhopal is in central India. And it's at the crossroads of every important empires, and it's a very important place actually. So he asked the people to come here, and that started the Bhopal state, and it was given legitimacy by the distant Mughal Empire, by those giving annual tributes to them. And there was also considerably good relationship with the British as well, but they were not a significant power back in the time when those was designing and making and putting Bhopal into a reality. So, well, if the state was formed by the grit and craftiness of those, it was sustained by astute policies of its queen consorts to the Begums of Bhopal. One of the interesting features of the Bhopal state is that it was consistently being consistently seen female royal women, that's in the form of sisters or queen consorts, calling shots or in the focal points of administration, which means that the Bhopali subjects, right from its inception, was not unfamiliar with the concept of women calling shots or women holding the power. It was just that they were not quite familiar with the instance of women becoming sovereign beacons, so ruling in their own right. That is official in the capacity as official beacons. But it was this coincidental tradition itself, I think, that empowered generation after generation royal women in this dynasty, in the Bhopal dynasty, to become sovereign begums of Bhopal. So, for instance, when you look at the history of the state, as I told you before, it is this instance of women ruling or ruling on behalf of the ruling monarch dispels our idea about Muslim backwardness or backwardness of women in Muslim religion and society. And for me, how Bhopal worked was, it was kind of deconstructing all the stereotyped ideas I had about the Bhopal. So in 1890, that's when the Begums of Bhopal's era started. An unfortunate event happened. It was the death of the young Nawab of Bhopal, who was Sikander Begum's father and the first Begum of Bhopal, Queenship Begum's husband. He was shot dead by his 8-year-old nephew, which was considered to be an accident. Actually, it was like, I don't know, there is still controversy. It's debates happening on whether it was orchestrated or whether it was an accident. Nevertheless, he was dead, which, though unfortunately, led to 100 years of rule of the Begums. And if you ask me why 100 years, it could have ended in 20 years of rule and it could have passed to any other male heirs. That is where the interesting thing all happened. So Queenship Begum was a very formidable wife, Begum, who on the day of her husband's funeral, as recorded in a couple of books, came out of the veil, came out of Pada, and addressed a collective of ulema, which is a Muslim authority which gives legitimacy for a Muslim ruler to rule, and to the British assembled there, saying that the throne should pass to me. I should be the regent on behalf of my minor doctor, Sikander Begum, who was only 1.5 years old back then. And when you look back, I really don't know what she correctly, said were back to convince these patriarchal people to let her have the throne. But records say that she cited instances from Islamic history where there were instances where women ruled, or in the case of the Prophet's daughter, Prophet's wife, Aisha, and even she cited the case of British queens ruling like Elizabeth. And it was where the global queenship rituals come into play. How the colonial empire began to, the colonial discourse began to backfire on the British as well. You have a queen. Why not be? I can become a queen. It's a very interesting part. And somehow people were convinced, and she became the regent of Bhopal on behalf of her minor Dr. Sikander Begum. And she ruled for 17 years until 1837. In 1837, Sikander was married to her cousin Jahangir Muhammad Khan, and the pact was to transfer the crown to Nawab Sikander Begum's husband upon her marriage. And then you see that it wasn't so feminist after all. You see the familiar thing happening. But, that is when you have to put the spotlight on Nawab Sikander Begum, who was very, very competent ruler and who knew that I am a better ruler than anybody that Bhopal can have. And she was a person who was constantly trying to arrest power, and Jahangir was aware of this. Jahangir was not a very effective ruler. though he didn't make much of a fuss, he was not a good ruler. So Sikander Begum had a very difficult relationship. Her husband, he tried to kill her. There was several bad chapter as far as their marriage is concerned. But eventually he died, and that is soft to her something. She didn't assaulted him. She waited. She knew that with his lifestyle, he's going to die anyway. I'm going to get the throne anyway, and that is what make her a perfect queen. I would say it wasn't military aggression. Yes, and she then convinced that she had a doctor by then, and it was interestingly for 3 generations, Bhopali Begums didn't have the ability to produce male heirs. Fortunately, we have the history of Begums of Bhopal. She again had a doctor, only a doctor, and she asked the British to make her the regent on behalf of her son, Dr. Shah Jahan Begum, which the British agreed to, and then began the golden era in the history of Bhopal. And she was the most competent ruler Bhopal had ever seen, and the future ruler, future Begums had tried to mold a second Sikandar out of every single heir apparent they had. She was very masculine. I don't know whether it's a good thing to say, as we have progressed along the lines of critical theories. We know that assuming a very masculine thing is not a very, praiseworthy thing. But then she exuded certain kinds of qualities that made the British, speechless. They couldn't raise any kind of complaints against her, and she ruled for from 1848 to 1868. And what makes her the most interesting queen is that her vision for Bhopal's women or royal women exceeded beyond her own reign. Okay, it wasn't just the fact that she wanted to become the reigning monarch, or she wanted to become the queen. She wanted women of the successive generation to become queens in their own right as well. It is this feminist tendency what makes Nawab Sikander Begum my favorite Begum among the Begums of Bhopal. And she, after becoming the regent, she first asked the British to give her lifelong regency, citing that after she was the heir apparent, since she is alive, it's not right for her doctor to take over her. And also asked for the introduction of the office of non-executive consort, which means that her doctor's husband, will never ever, get the throne. It will be Shah Jahan herself who become the reigning queen. And after that, her own doctor, Sultan Jahan Begum. And it was this far-sighted, and it was, again, she convinced British by using precedents of Queen Victoria becoming the queen. Why, as I mentioned before, if she can, why can't us? Yeah. And she also made it a point to, at times, at times criticize, even if subtly, even if very in a soft manner, though, to point out the double standards of British colonial enterprise and their emancipation of women, the policy of emancipation of women. And yeah, that's the and I know I'm taking a bit longer time than to narrate this. Yeah. So NSP came into power in 1844, and she became queen in 1868. And one of the spectacular features of NSP is that she had started the tradition of history writing or life writing in the Bhopal dynasty, and she knew that it was important. Otherwise, everyone will conveniently ignore them or forget them. And it was she who started this tradition, and it was this tradition that was religiously followed by her two successors, Shah Jahan Begum and Sultan Jahan Begum. Shah Jahan Begum, the next Begum was of a different kind, kind than the two preceding Begums. She was the longest reigning Begum, ruled for 33 years, and she ruled till 1901, and she was more of a very feminine kind of a person, if I can call that so. Very Epicurean, and very much a patron of literature, arts, and festivals. And her era was actually strewn with certain controversies and scandals, because she didn't quite follow Islamic codes, neither Islamic codes or British codes of propriety for a queen. She kind of exercised her agency in a manner different from that of her predecessors. I think that comes from the kind of liberty, kind of privileged position into which both the preceding Begums have put her. Now she has the ability to live in a manner that she likes. The other Begums had to kind of continuously be cautious of how they are carrying themselves, because they had this immense task of normalizing and legitimizing women's rule. But on the other hand, Shah Jahan Begum harvested the fruit of all that, I would rather say. And the third Begum, Sultan Jahan Begum, was last reigning Begum of Bhopal, and she was a very progressive woman. All of the Begums patronized, were patrons of colonial modern projects like secular infrastructures like hospitals, colleges, railway, transport systems. So was now Sultan Jahan Begum. And her era, her reign is spectacular, or it's quite unique for the kind of travels she undertook to the Europe, and the effect it had on her own perspective of women's position, her own perspective of the relationship between the colonial empire, the imperial center, and the colonial empire. And yes, and the last thing she did was to secure succession, or the throne of Bhopal, to her youngest son, in the presence of her eldest son's son. Two elder sons were already passed away, so she wanted to secure the throne for herself. And for that, she traveled all the way to Britain to convince King George that, okay, we want to get this done, and on surpassing the protocol that the viceroy in India has already ruled against her wishes, but she took the long journey to England to prove a point that she is still calling shots. Yeah. And yes, that is about the Begums of Bhopal in a nutshell. And to conclude that, Sultan Jahan Begum wanted to strike off male primogeniture and to bring in non-gendered primogeniture. And that is her last, I would say, seminal action as far as Muslim sovereign, female sovereign in the Muslim state was concerned. Yes.
Wow. What a history, that there's so much happening, and yet why is this not kind of front and center? And it's amazing to see kind of the similarities with kind of queenship that our listeners might be more familiar with, of this idea that you have to legitimize your place on the throne, in a sense. And so you've talked a little bit about kind of pulling in these precedents, and then being able to say, well, my family's already done it, or this other person's already done it, so why can't I? And so just wondering if you could maybe say a few more words on how the Begums really legitimize their place and legitimize their power.
So legitimizing their rule was crucial to their aim because they were Muslim rulers in a Muslim principality with no such history of precedence. So it was important for them to convince not only their subjects or the ulema, the Islamic ulema, but also the British of their legitimacy to rule. And that is when, as I have mentioned below, their creative employment of colonial law and global queenship traditions come into play. So, as I have already mentioned, Nawab Sikander Begum has used very creatively colonial law, the terms in the treaties to shift the wind in her direction. Like saying that since she is the heir apparent, as long as she is alive, she remains the heir apparent. And she kind of pointed out the loopholes in the colonial law and, brought it against them. And the British was speechless. And it was the first time in history that British had to actually change the decision that they made in public. And it was such an important event in the history of, women's history in colonial India, or history of Indian princes in colonial India, so to speak. But I don't know, maybe it is the fact that an emerging Hindu nationalism didn't want to kind of talk more about the agency of a Muslim woman, that we conveniently ignored them, or it can also be a concerted effort on the part of the later nationalist movement to actually picture Indian princes as an anachronism from the past who were just very submissive active when the colonialism happened. So the other methods being showing competency as a ruler. So the other method for the British regularly inspected the competency of Indian princes, and it was you cannot really call them in the current sense of the term. If you call them princes, they were not all free. They had to constantly, show their British masters that they have the ability to remain on power, and they are doing whatever in their power to improve the situation of their subjects. And that was done through exposing what competency meant in colonial era, that is supporting modernity projects like infrastructural activities like hospitals, education, and all kinds of things, importing science and technology and all kinds of things they thought was modern. And the other method in which the Begums showed their competency and not competency per se, tried to legitimize their power was through showing public piety towards Islamic creeds. The fact that they are living in an era where the British is the overarching power doesn't mean that they can completely ignore where their divine power to rule comes from. It is from Allah. And they have to constantly convince the ulema that they are devout Muslims. And that is when very interesting things about Begums of Bhopal happen. They have Nawab Sikander Begum is the first ever Muslim ruler to visit Mecca, to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. At that point in time, visiting Mecca was a very dangerous thing. It took time, first of all. And secondly, there were so many plagues and pestilences happening, and the chances of the ruler getting back to their principality safe and sound to rule was very minimal. So no ruler, Muslim ruler, right from Akbar the Great to that of Aurangzeb, never visited Mecca, did a pilgrimage. It was the prerogative of the royal women to do that. So, but when Sikander undertook this journey, it was not as a royal woman from a Muslim royal household, it was as a sovereign Begum of Bhopal. And she was risking it all to visit the Mecca. And that was a response to her to her Islamic subjects, because it was a very planned event, because she supported the British in 1857 revolution, the first war of independence, which was considered a Mohammedan conspiracy by the British. The titular head was Bahadur Shah, and even her mother and all the Islamic clerks and Maulavis all wanted her to support the Mughal cause and not give any kind of support to the British. But she was quite visionary. She supported the British, and of course the British was the one who came out victorious. But then, since the British came out victorious, she then had the duty to show her obedience to the Islamic creed, to her religion, saying that she is not an infidel. And that is why she went to the extra mile to do all this. She even went to the extreme of visiting a Juma Masjid in Delhi, which was converted to a stable by the British to insult, to give punishment to the idea that it was a Mohammedan conspiracy. After everything, was subsided, she went to the Juma Masjid. She herself cleaned the clothes and opened the mosque again for worship. And this was her strategy, I would rather say, rather than her devout nature, because she was a very strategic, very, very, very clever ruler who knew how to play both the religious card and the card as the imperial subject. Yes. And yeah, I think the immense task of legitimization fell on Qudsiya Begum, the first Begum, and Nawab Sikander Begum. As it is evident, it was in fact Nawab Sikander Begum, with her far-sightedness of installing two future generations also as sovereign Begums in their own right, which made the Begums of Bhopal a possibility. Otherwise, these two queens would have been relegated as, some temporary unforeseen thing that happened, and we could have easily glozed over them. We could have easily overlooked them. It was Nawab Sikander Begum with her father. She thought that it should be made into a law. The succession should be, concrete and should be written on a paper that, okay, this throne will pass to Shah Jahan, her doctor, and then to her granddaughter, Sultan Jahan Begum. And I think it was, when you think about how they legitimized their role, it's all very fascinating. There's more to it, but it's just their plan to legitimize in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible to see. I think this really brings us nicely to the next thing I wanted to ask, is these ideas of piety and the laws and the really outward appearance of power is something that is very similar, I think, between European queens and the Begums that you've talked about so far. And so I think our listeners might be more familiar with these ideas of Western European queenship. And so we've seen some of the similarities, I think, but what are some of the maybe big similarities and differences between, we'll say, European queenship and India and the Begums?
Well, I will first start with the similarities. Indian queenship, as in European queenship, although at times performed corporate monarchy, the hierarchy existed between the genders, that is, between the king and the queen, was quite pronounced throughout its history, as in Europe. In ancient Indian courts on kingship, women were not entertained as rulers, as in many tests on European kingship literature, and as in the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women by John Knox, that it is against Bible. So we see that kind of, slight mention that women's rule is unnatural in certain kingship-related codes and conduct in Indian literature as well. Nevertheless, various Indian kingdoms saw the rule of queens at various points in time, as in Europe. It was not a rare thing; it happened. And as you mentioned, public piety, pilgrimages, and patronages of religious institutions was very much part of the Indian queenship ritual. And unofficial nature of Queen's power was a similarity I find between European queenship and Indian queenship, and of course using marriage is a feature that you find in both the cases. But come to the difference is what makes I think Indian queenship quite interesting. The first major difference is the diversity of Indian queenship rituals, because there were so many religions, so many religious practices, so many cultures that went into making different kind of queenship rituals in different states. If I'm taking colonial India as a case in point, there are 564 princely states. 564 princely states in colonial India. And these 564 princely states may had some kind of similar uniform codes, as in many of them were Rajput states, which may had a similar queenship rituals. Many of them were Maratha states, which may have a similar code of conduct. Many of them were states from down south, which had a very interesting queenship ritual. And the overarching factor that connects all these states were the British paramountcy. And even though the British paramountcy was trying to homogenize queenship rituals, just like they were trying to homogenize religion, it was the British who brought in the idea of Hinduism as we see it today, actually, through their census. The gender codes, they've tried to kind of make sense of what India is through homogenizing gender along the lines of the British conceptions of gender. So they were trying to homogenize queenship rituals too, because it was varied across Indian subcontinent. For instance, if you, I don't know whether you have heard of this, Travancore, if India was still under the colonial princely rule, I would have been a subject of the Travancore king. Travancore is a state, is a colonial princely state, and Travancore and the states in Kerala, where I'm coming from, followed matrilineal succession, which meant the family of the king constituted not of his wife, but of the king passed from the king to the king's sister's sons. In the absence of a male heir, the king's sister herself became the sovereign queen of the state, and there were no problem with that. And when the British came, they found it quite conflicting. How can women become sovereign queens in their own right? It must be really, there might be some kind of problem with them. And when during the eve of colonial rule, the Travancore queens, who otherwise should have considered regnant queens, were only given the position of regent queens. Regent queens. They were demoted to the position of regency. And this kind of colonial interventions can be found across 564 princely states in different manner. But what again attracts me to Begums of Bhopal, where in such kingdoms where there was strong tradition and precedence of women becoming queens, and the British altered it topsy-turvy, turned it topsy-turvy. Here are a group of 4 Begums enjoying all the benefits of being sovereign Begums of Bhopal. Yeah, so that is one difference. That is this incursions from a colonial power in a manner which was unprecedented in European queenship history, as well as the diversity that forms Indian queenship. You don't have you cannot call someone an Indian queen. It should go into details. You should call her either a Rajput queen or Maratha queen or a Travancore queen. You have to go into a detail, right? Otherwise, she is incomplete. And the second difference is the possibility of interreligious marriages, which I think was absent in European culture. It has to be Christian, right? International marriages were allowed, but interreligious were never allowed, I assume. And interreligious marriages were conducted to form alliances or consolidate alliances right from Akbar the Great to that of Dost Muhammad Khan, the founder of Bhopal state. One of the wives of Dost Muhammad Khan was a Rajput girl. Rajput is a noble family, Hindu noble family. And her name was Fateh Bibi. And she was the most important figure in the formation of Bhopal state. She was very important. She was the beloved wife and principal wife of Dost Muhammad Khan. And it was after her the ensign of the Bhopal state is named, Fateh Nishan. So that kind of a possibility was there where, people married into different religions, and that kind of also ensured a kind of harmony between religions. Seeing a Hindu queen, most often Muslim states were formed amidst Hindu population. So seeing a Hindu queen was important for their subject to see that their culture or their ways of life will be represented by a premier woman to their chief of the state. Yeah, that is there. That I think is a very wonderful difference between Indian queenship and European queenship. And another important facet is queen's role was officially unofficial. By which what I mean is that talking from my limited foray into coronation rituals in India, I've never seen any record of a queen consort being installed as queen consort, a coronation ceremony for the queen consort. So the power, the agency that was held by the queen was definitely unofficial. And given the polygamous nature of the Indian codes, the status of the Maharani, the Maharani means the great queen or the principal queen, was also in a flex. Unlike in Europe, where there was only installed queen for the realm, in India there were a Maharani, senior Ranis, junior Ranis, and even the concubines stood a chance to becoming the premier woman of the realm. Maharani status can be dependent on either her ability to give the dynasty a male heir, or in the presence of many Ranis and many male heirs, the favorite Rani's child became the heir. So the Maharani, the very position of Maharani was a very, very insecure position, so to speak, unlike that in European queenship. And there was obviously the Sanana and Parda system, as I mentioned before, and then there is this very famous custom, infamous, if I may, sadi, which was widow immolation. That is, once her husband dies, she was supposed to self-immolate in the funeral pyre of her husband, which I'm quite positive was not there in Europe. So I think these are some points of difference between Indian queenship and European queenship. Yes.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it's amazing to see how very independently we get these women using kind of the same sorts of power and seeing those similarities that grow as a result of the position. But then these big differences, because kind of what we now would call India is not what they would recognize, and that it's such a different context. And so obviously power has to reflect that context. And as you were saying about kind of the inter-religious marriages, I was thinking, Yeah, the big thing, especially in England, is the quote unquote horror of a Protestant monarch marrying a Catholic. But they're still both Christian, as you say. And so this idea of an English monarch marrying a Muslim or marrying a Hindu is just kind of completely unthought of. And I think that's incredibly interesting how that brings a sense of stability when there is this sense that, I might not be the same religion as the main ruler, but I do have this connection with someone else. I think that's what a dynastic kind of peace move in order to stabilize rule. Oh, I'm learning so much.
Yeah. On a related note, the British used to have very serious reservations about Indian princes marrying English women. They were like a Karnataka prince, if I am not wrong, who wanted to marry an English or Australian woman who goes by the name Molly. And there was like satirical princes of, my God, Maharani Molly. How would that sound? You know? And the very idea of ethnic missing or interreligious missing was an anathema for the British. And in the face of all that, India showed a kind of dynamic engagement with different religions, which I think was very fascinating to keep communal harmony intact. It is this most interestingly, what attracts me to these interreligions is not the alliance part or keeping a vast state under control. It is the way in which a subject constituting of Muslims and Hindus can see a corporate monarchy where both of them are represented, which is a wonderful thing, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that historical Europe could have learned from this.
Yeah.
And so as we get towards the end of our episode, can you give us an idea of what you're currently working on? We've heard about the larger PhD project, but what is it that you're focusing on at the moment in that bigger project?
Okay, currently I'm looking at the travels and travelogues of these Begums of Bhopal. I mentioned before, these women were avid travelers, and they traveled with purpose, not for leisure. And the colonial era was a period where travel for leisure was also a thing in vogue, and you see many such accounts of the Maharanis traveling and how they find freedom in the foreign land. They feel free to come out of their powder and no one is staring at them. And back in Bombay at the shipyard, they came from back in Purda. And that kind of accounts are there. And also there is accounts of, the camaraderie shared between different royal women belong to different royal households. There was this one particular incident that I found interesting, was relating to the last Begum's granddaughter and the next heir apparent of Bhopal, Abida Sultan, who wrote an interesting memoir, which is titled Memoir of a Rebel Princess. And in this, her grandmother, the last Begum of Bhopal, was very strict, and she was a very, very staunch Muslim, asking her always to follow Parda. And she was a bit rebellious. She wanted to follow some kind of fashion and stuff. So when these women, when these royal families usually go to hill stations, to enjoy their summertime, because it's going to get really hot in central India in summer. They go to hill stations like Shimla or Ooty to enjoy themselves, and that is where they see all these royal families together for an evening cup of tea, for a board game, and there they will have a possibility to talk about all of that. And there's this thing recorded in her memoir that Princess Gayatri Devi and her mother actually kind of gave her advice on how to wear fashionable dress, how we can do fashionable dressing within the limited framework of what she is allowed to, and that kind of a camaraderie, sartorial reconfiguration, however silly we might think it is. It was important for her own, subjectivity, that is to dress in a particular way and to kind of pronounce her identity as such. And that kind of a camaraderie was happening in colonial India because of the way empire was working back then. So what I'm working right now is on the travelogues written by these queens, especially the travelogues on their pilgrimages to Mecca. Two travelogues, currently I'm focusing on Nawab Sikander Begum's travelogue and Sultan Jahan Begum's travelogue, which was written in two different centuries. One in 19th century and other in 20th century. The way in which these both Begums expose or express a different kind of devotion to Islamic religion, the intentions behind their travels, the way in which they record their experience of the pilgrimage. For instance, in NSB's Sikander Begum's narrative, you don't see her talking about the kind of spiritual experience she had. She is constantly, she was written in Urdu, and which means that it was meant to be written by her, meant to be read by her own subjects, not the English. It was later translated into English by one of the wives of her political agents. So it was meant for the subjects of Bhopal state. And here she is continuously trying to put forward an idea how competent a ruler she is. And she is kind of saying that, okay, Mecca is very unsafe. They don't have good drainage system. They don't have this infrastructure, that infrastructure. And she's constantly comparing the Mecca, the holy city, to her own state, where her mother and herself is doing all kinds of work to improve the living condition of her subject. And it is this interesting facet where she herself becomes the representative of the colonial apparatus, the imperial government, as well as she writes in a manner to kind of, assure her subjects that I have made a good decision to stick with the British. We are far off than a region without the British control. We are advancing, and I am a good ruler to you. And it is this kind of facets that I'm exploring right now, and it's very interesting.
Gosh, that sounds like more in a sense. I am so excited to kind of see the finished product here. And just this idea of kind of those comparisons between what am I used to and what's happening somewhere else. And these comparisons that they're making in these travelogues of, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I learning? Just what an intimate view into their personal experiences. That's incredible.
Thank you.
And I guess that brings us to this idea of perspectives and this idea of kind of how each of us looks at the world around us and how we understand it. And so the question that I've been kind of asking all of my guests so far is, how does your own position, your own perspective influence your interest in history and your understanding of history and queenship? And so how does your identity as a female scholar and an Indian female scholar, how does that kind of dictate or influence how you've approached what you do?
That's a very interesting question because, first of all, I will answer my position as an Indian scholar. So when I attended conferences and presented papers, one of the first questions I was asked from Indian scholars and researchers were, why study about queens in an era where they're no longer relevant? Unlike in England or in parts of Europe or even in parts of Asia, the monarchy still hold at least symbolic or nominal role. India has severed its relationship with its princely past in the mid-20th century. In fact, the discourses that the Princess of India is a vestige from the past was very much there since the first decade of the 20th century. So studying queenship in contemporary India means I have to convince not only my research peer group, but also laymen who might consider this an unproductive fling with a buried past. For some, it is the democratic turn India took makes the study of queenship irrelevant. But for me, it is the most relevant reason why I should continue to study about the queens, because there has been a concerted effort to erase the political capital the princess had and popularize a narrative of the decadent princess. So it was only when you could actually convince the subject that your king is no more relevant or no more good for your progress, that they could successfully transition into a democracy in 1947. And it takes concerted effort to erase their legacy. And that's what we find in the oblivion to which Begums of Bhopal is now relegated. So my reason for studying as an Indian scholar is it's present as well. It's a democratic political institution that we are following right now as well. As an Indian scholar, I acknowledge the benefits of democratic institution India has right now and its benefits on Indian citizens. But I'm also critically aware of India's royal past, the many subversions orchestrated by its princes, and the lasting legacy conveniently ignored by the present discourses. So it is my answer to the first part of the question, that is my position as an Indian scholar. Now comes the next part. How do I approach queenship studies as a female scholar? My interest in queenship studies is not limited to the past, but how women in power continues to be represented in popular discourses and to trace its origin and continuity from its colonial past. As I mentioned before, matrilineal succession was the thing in Travancore state. But when it came to later Malayalam movies, when you actually represent queens, kings and queens, they are represented in the normative heterosexual settings where queen is the wife of the king and not the sister of the king. It is such kind of representation which actually has a colonial backing, because colonial power had a very important say in making that so. So it is that kind of continuities and origin that I want to trace as a female scholar doing queenship studies in India. And I'm keen to understand how convenient erasure of powerful women from mainstream discourses continues to serve narrow nationalism, patriarchal conceptualization of new Indian women, and the discursive possibilities of castigating women from certain communities as backward and needs reform and rescue. As a female scholar from India, I want to unveil a rich history where women exercised considerable power both within and outside royal households, problematizing both colonial and nationalist discourses on women's restricted and deplorable position in Indian society. For long, post-colonial studies or studies on gender and coloniality focused only on common women, reform movements, social evils, and the ensuing colonial legislation. I think it's high time we focus our attention back on elite women subjects who kind of navigated the colonial era in a way that's very praiseworthy. We have books like Manus Pillai's Ivory Thrones and Fawzali's, and there is a recent surge in interest in colonial India queens, which is very reassuring, but still there are much more work to be done in that respect. And as I mentioned below, we have concentrated, invested so much of our scholarly energy on warrior queens in colonial India. And I think it's high time we have to also focus on the diplomatic resistance some of these queens successfully exhibited, and made their state survive way into 1947. That's still Indian independence.
Yeah, and just this idea that even in countries that no longer have monarchy is one of the oldest institutions. And so can we really understand kind of 2023 if we don't understand what's come before? And can we really understand kind of this shift away from monarchy if we don't understand why monarchy is so important? And as you say, this idea that we have to understand that, and we have to understand that women have power, that women are 50% of the population, but are not necessarily 50% of the history. And so how do we sometimes tease them out, but often it's how do we just say they're already there, we're just not talking about it. And just the significance of understanding, what are our expectations today, and how is that affecting what we expect to see historically? There's just so many points there of how complex history is, and how complex gender is.
Yes. There's more to what we see today. There's more to what we see in history textbooks today. And it is the layered nature of history that's what makes it more interesting, more complex, and enlightening as well.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And so the final thing, I think we've touched on it and we've alluded to it, but we maybe haven't addressed it kind of head on, is we've just had an episode talking about Queen Victoria and empire. So looking at that from the British perspective. And so, as I say, we've touched on it. Can you talk a little bit more about these politics of colonial queenship and these interactions of especially I think the Begums, but of that relationship with Britain and that relationship with Islam and this relationship with kind of other big powers?
To begin with, I would say Begums of Bhopal's relationship with the colonial power, with the empire, so to speak, was symbiotic. It was very mutual, So the diplomatic relations that they have cultivated all throughout their 100 years reign was a mutual alliance where both the parties benefited in a way that is very, constructive for them. Both of the parties. To explain that a little bit more, it would be the princes were entrusted with the task of endorsing the civilizing mission. Britain's presence had to be constantly validated by its own colonial subjects, and there were no better candidates than Indian princes to do that, and they endorsed it through. Taking up modern projects like, as I mentioned before, colonial infrastructures, and in turn, British guaranteed security for their state and for their dream. And it was the kind of relationship that we find across the state since 1858, that since the first War of Independence, where Queen Victoria was proclaimed as the Empress of India. The crown took over India, and East India Company ceased to exist as the dominant power. So, to quote Miles Tyler, I would say Indian reverence for the Queen in extension to the colonial apparatus might be seen as clientelism or collaboration. That is to say, loyalism was a device by which concessions might be extracted from the colonial power. Loyalty to Queen Victoria was not just incidental to 19th century Indian nationalism. It was a polite addition for the sake of form. It was central to its ideology. So, if you actually look at these queens' interaction with the colonial empire, I would say one of the biggest improvement happened as far as royal women's life was considered with regards to coloniality was there was suddenly an opening, suddenly a possibility for the women to travel. And travel, the coming of ships and all other mediums meant they could travel, which was quite not the case before. And they could travel to different continents. And traveling to different continents, as I mentioned before, meant that not following the Senana spatial constrictions anymore, not following the Parda anymore, and they could explore a life which was very, very different from what they were experiencing in India. And so they could travel for leisure, for education, and there was this other kind of travel that existed in colonial India for the princes, which was for petitioning. You have instances of royal women traveling all the way from India, all the way from India to the British Buckingham Palace to meet with the king and petition to them that, okay, what the colonial officials has done is unfair. You should remedy it. It is this kind of a feeling that these people who are themselves kings, who themselves are aware, since Britain has moved into constitutional monarchy, the king and the queens are themselves aware of the, restrictions that this kind of a setup is kind of having on them. And it is this kind of imperial citizenship which ensured a kind of communication, a conversation with a British counterpart, however superior they might be in protocol, is what makes the interactions of these Begums of Bhopal with the empire a bit more nuanced and interesting. And this ability to have precedent cited, maybe some rule revoked, by traveling directly to the imperial center and saying that it is your king who says this, so you have to follow that. And yes, that is one aspect. And the other aspect, which I have already mentioned, is the way in which princes were, although maybe internally quite unsatisfied with the ways in which the Britain was controlling them, the colonial officials were controlling them, surveying their day-to-day activities, and they had to be, reported every now and then. I think there was this pride which was there among the princes, that they are imperial subjects and they are part of a bigger project that's happening. That might be the science and technology that they are bringing in, the power that their imperial center is becoming. And this is exactly what you can see in Nawab Sikander Begum's description of how she was seeing, Mecca, which is a holy place for Muslims, and it shouldn't be disparaged like she did. But there was not a what I can see from those that narrative is that she is not there as a Muslim. She was there as an imperial subject, judging Mecca on behalf of her colonial masters, and saying that if the Sultan of Turkey could actually give me this much amount of money, or if you allow me, I can send my son-in-law and my doctor to actually bring in a good governance over this place. And this kind of thinking doesn't come along from the fact that she's a competent ruler. It comes from the fact that she is a competent ruler under the British paramountcy and the security that it gives her. And this is kind of the engagements that we can see there. Even though these engagements might sound a bit yielding and psychophantic in nature, at times when the colonial powers were too much to bear, if I can put it so, these Begums had their own way to react to them. They were not always accepting whatever the British said. For instance, when it comes to Sultan Jahan Begum, she was a staunch Muslim, as I said before. So when the Khilafat movement came in, which was she stood with the Ottoman Sultan and not with the British. And it was her understanding that basically I'm a Muslim ruler, a Muslim believer, and my position as imperial subject is secondary or tertiary is what we can see in all the Begums when it comes to certain matters that is crucial to their own existence and belief. So I think their interaction with empire was as complex as their lives, as their layered history. Yeah,
I think you've said this so perfectly. This idea that it's not just what Britain is telling to its colony at this point. It's that there's this two-way relationship, that there's this movement of people, of rulers, and there's this movement of ideas and goods, but that it's not just from colonizer to colonize. It's a two-way system in a sense. And that the Begums are saying, we don't like this, but we are going to use this to our advantage. And just the incredible complexity there. This has made me want to learn even more, having had this conversation. So I want to say thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolutely incredible conversation. And I hope that listeners have learned even half of what I have picked up. And just your enthusiasm is honestly infectious. It's so exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strong, for having me, because it was absolute pleasure to talk about the Begums, because most of us research scholars, we used to write on and on, and we never really speak about them in a way which is non-academic, so to speak, in a conversation manner. And it's absolutely exhilarating and it was exciting to actually talk about who these Begums were, and I'm happy that you enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for being part of this wonderful conversation. So we are heading in our next episode, we are heading to Asia. We are heading up to what is now Japan and Korea to talk about empresses and queens consort. So thank you again to Annie Joseph for today, and we will have you all back on the episode very soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.